In this video, I'm going to talk through how to answer questions on paper 1, which is our Medicine Through Time paper, and the Western Front. So, I will give some examples and also talk through how to structure and some sentence starters for how to best go about answering the question. Okay, so the first section of the paper is the section on the Western Front. And the first question will always be describe two features of something. So we always say describe two features of, and then it will give something that you have to describe two features of. In this case, we've been given the regimental aid posts, part of the chain of evacuation. So to answer this question, you have to identify a feature. Feature 1, here we could say that they were usually located in the trenches. Feature 1 has been identified, 1 mark achieved. But you also need to develop this point, and maybe the word explained used here isn't the correct word. Maybe we should have put developed. So develop this point a little bit more. This is because they were the first place that soldiers went to for treatment on the Western Front. Essentially, identify a feature, give a little bit of knowledge about it. Here's another example. So they were staffed by 1 medical officer. Feature 2. And that develops a little bit more, explained. This person would decide who could be patched up and returned to the front and who needed further care. So here we've got 1 feature with a little bit of knowledge about it, another feature with another little bit of knowledge about it. That's where your 4 marks for this question come from. Avoid listing form 4 features and avoid spending too long developing your knowledge for these features because it is only worth 4 marks. Okay, moving on. So, question 2A is always study sources A and B, and it will ask you how useful the sources are. So always say how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into, and then this will be the variation. It will give you a topic that you have to look into. So this first line will always be the same, and this will be different. So in this case, we've got health problems faced by soldiers in the trenches. Okay, so here is source A. And here is source B. A source is useful, essentially, if it gives us information relevant to our inquiry that is accurate. So if we can pick out some information from these sources that is relevant to our inquiry, health problems faced by soldiers in the trenches, and that information is accurate, then we can say that that source is useful. So, here is source A. It shows us that trench foot was an issue and that the army were aware of it and tried to solve it. The nature of the source, so remember we're looking at nature, origin and purpose here to test how accurate the source is. Okay, so we're looking at these 3 things to test how accurate the source is. And we've got the nature being a picture of soldiers. The origin is from the time of World War I in the trenches. And the purpose is potentially to show people at home that it was being treated and these soldiers were being looked after. Right, so I'm going to quickly skip over this. So is it useful? Possibly. Let's look at an answer. So, source A, this should say source A. Source A is useful because it shows us that trench foot was an issue in the trenches and that the army were aware of it. The source suggests this because we can see medics treating soldiers' feet. This is likely to be accurate because I know that the trench foot was a major issue. This was due to the extremely wet conditions in the trenches, especially at the 3rd Battle of Ypres. The purpose of the source might be to persuade people at home that soldiers were being looked after. This makes me question the accuracy of the source because I know that the government were keen to maintain support for the war. If people at home realise that soldiers were not being looked after, they may turn against the war effort. Overall, the source is fairly useful because it gives us information that is likely to be accurate. So here, what I've done is I've first of all picked out information from the source. Remember, this should be source A. In fact, I'll change it for us right now. So I've said it gives us some information about our inquiry, problems, health problems in the trenches, and that was that trench foot occurred. I've then used my own knowledge. To test that. Okay, and I've said that I know trench foot was an issue because I know, and this is good knowledge here, good specific knowledge, that there were very wet conditions, especially at Ypres. Okay, very good bits of knowledge to test the source and what it's saying and whether that makes it accurate. Okay, I've then moved on to look at the nature, the origin, and the purpose. And you don't have to talk about all of these things. If you notice, I've only talked about the purpose here. I've only talked about the purpose. And I said it might be to persuade people at home that soldiers are being looked after. Right, I've then said that it makes me question the accuracy. Okay, so I'm testing the accuracy of the source. Remember, a source is useful if it gives us information that is accurate. Right? I've then given some more knowledge to suggest why this might be the case. Okay? Afterwards, I've made a summary sentence to give an overall judgment on the source. I'm giving an overall judgment on the source based on our criteria. Information, accurate. Okay? You then do the same for the other source. You do not need to compare them. Okay, you do the same thing for the other source. You do not need to compare them. Tip for this question is, if you don't include any of your own knowledge, you're limited to 4 marks out of 8. Okay, you can't get more than 4 marks unless you bring in some of your own knowledge. Okay, moving on. So, question 2. It will always say study source something. It might say source B, it might say source A. And this gives you 4 sections to answer. First one says detail in source B that I would follow up. Here, you're selecting a detail. That essentially means a quote from the source. If it's a picture, you need to describe a little section of that source. Okay, so you're picking out a quote. I would make this related to medicine. So ideally pick a quote that is related to medicine. I've gone with the gangrene found amongst our wounded. Okay, related to medicine, related to injuries, related to health in some way. Excuse me. The next one is question I would ask. Here, identify one question you could ask to find out more about the issue you have identified above. So, we need to raise a question here about gangrene. Right? I've gone for how common was gangrene. A tip for this bit of this question is to go with a how many or a how common or a how often question. Okay? This makes the next question a lot easier because here we need to provide a source that is going to help us find the answer to this question. You need to go beyond just saying medical records. We need to make it specific to our issue. So, I've gone for medical records from base hospitals in Belgium and France. I could say in World War I there, just to guarantee that I'm going to get the mark. Okay? And this one is probably the trickiest one because it needs a bit of thinking. But by asking a how common or a how many question, it makes it a bit easier. Okay? So you need to explain how it will help you. By asking a how common or a how many question here, you can almost definitely say this every time. It's going to give the number of soldiers who, in this case, suffered from gangrene. Okay? It will give a number of soldiers. You can count the number of people who have been recorded in these medical records. Okay? So, I'm not saying you have to do a how common or a how many question, but I advise it as it is the easiest way to get the marks for this bottom question. Okay, moving on. Question 3. This is where we move on to the medicine through time section. And this will say, explain one way in which the treatments for... Well, it will say, explain one way in which something, in this case it's treatments for illness, were similar. It might say different here. It might say different. And then it will give you 2 time periods. Okay, so it will say, explain one way in which something was similar or different in 2 time periods. Okay, in this case we've got, explain one way in which treatments for illness were similar in the 14th and 17th century. To go about answering this question, you need to first of all identify a similarity. Okay, here I've gone for bleeding was common in both time periods. Note that I've focused on a treatment for illness. Make sure you read this bit very carefully so that you can focus it. Here I've gone for bleeding, because that is a treatment that was common in both time periods. You then need to say a little bit about why they did that, okay? Explain that. So I've said here, this was because they believed in the 4 humours and opposite theory. If you want, you can go a bit further and say that these ideas were from Galen, and that Galen was still the most important doctor in these time periods with regards to treatment. Then what you need to do is give an example from both time periods. So first of all, we need to go 14th century. And the obvious one for the 14th century is always go for the Black Death. Okay, 14th century, always mention the Black Death. Then you need to use a connective word to show that you're comparing them. In this case, it's going to be similarly, because we're talking about a similarity. If we were talking about differences between the 2 time periods, we'd use however, whereas, on the other hand, something along those lines. Okay? But it's similarly. So similarly, when Charles II was ill, his surgeons used multiple times. His surgeons bled him multiple times in a period of a couple of days. Okay, so we've got similar things from the 2 time periods, using this connective word to show that we're comparing. Okay, using this connective word to show that we're comparing. Okay, moving on. Question 4. Question 4 will always be an explain why question. Explain why. And in this case, it is explain why there were changes. This might be continuity, but in this case it's changes in the understanding of the cause of disease during this period. It will always give you a period. That period could be 400 years, it could be 200 years, it could be 100 years. But in this case, we've got 1700 to 1900. So, as we can see here, I've split this into 3 paragraphs. And we're going to go with the classic PEE style paragraphs. And we're going to pick a factor for each. We're going to pick a factor for each paragraph. Okay? You need to include information that goes beyond the 2 prompts, which will usually be for your 3rd factor, hopefully. Remember to use specific knowledge in your explanations. Names, dates, facts, figures. And remember to focus on why something has happened, not just what. Using phrases like, this helped change because. Okay? So for this question, we might talk about individuals as our factor to start with, such as Pasteur, who developed germ theory during his time period. Second factor, we might look at technology as a factor, and that the microscope was invented during this time period. This helped see things at a smaller level. Germs could be identified, and then so on and so on. And then a final factor, we could look at government, and this is quite a tenuous one, but the French government actually funded Pasteur in his research, and the same goes for Robert Koch and the German government. Okay, so we've got 3 paragraphs, a factor for each one, a factor that caused change, and we've got specific knowledge to support it, and we need to say why this helped. Okay? Right. Question 5. Question 5 will always give you a statement in quote marks. It'll always give you a statement in quote marks. And it'll ask you, how far do you agree with that statement? And to explain that answer. It's 16 marks plus 4. That means 16 marks for your answer and 4 marks for your spag. Just do your best with the spag. So, first of all, you need to agree with the statement. Okay, you need to provide some evidence, some knowledge that agrees with the statement. Then, you need to disagree. It's like weighing up scales before you make your overall judgment. So, you might talk about, well, in fact, you will talk about the statement to start with. So here we've got Simpson. We need to talk about his use of chloroform and why it was such a brilliant turning point in surgery. The fact that it eliminated pain and that surgery could be done for longer and more sort of deeper into the body. Okay, you're then going to provide another bit of knowledge, okay, that agrees with it. For example, Queen Victoria used chloroform with the birth of one of her children, and this massively increased the amount of people that use chloroform. Therefore, it was more trusted, doctors were using it more frequently, and it became a better drug for an anaesthetic. Okay, then we need to use a phrase like on the other hand or whereas, or some might disagree because, and we're going to disagree with this statement. We could say someone like Lister and his use of aseptic surgery was a massive turning point in surgery. Okay, so Lister talking about carbolic spray is a mention of that, and then the development of aseptic surgery and why that was so important as a turning point in surgery. Okay, then you need to conclude. You need to have a conclusion here, and in this, you need to make a judgment. Okay, you need to make sure you make a judgment referring to criteria. So in this case, your criteria on how you judge which one was the biggest turning point, it's going to be on how many lives were saved. Okay, which one of these do you think would have saved the most lives? Okay, if you don't know, use an educated guess. Okay, it's going to be unlikely that you know the exact figures, but use your initiative to have a go at thinking, well, which one's going to save more lives. Okay, so that is the end of this video. Watch this again, watch it over and over again. It's just as important to revise how to answer the questions as it is the content. Okay, good luck for exams. Goodbye.